We're about to start now. I would like very much to do something different today. I don't want to, I'm trying to avoid the standard discussion on Afghanistan. Will it fall apart? You know, what is the role of Pakistan, etc., etc. What I'd really like to focus on, which I think is very important today especially, is mediation. There have been many attempts at mediation in Afghanistan, some of them partially successful even, and we have two experts who have been deeply involved in mediating. Riaz Mohammad Khan, Pakistan's former foreign secretary, also of course ambassador to China and many other countries, and by far the greatest and most read Pakistani scholar coming out of the Foreign Office. It's very rare for scholars to come out of the Foreign Office. And so we are very grateful to have him here. He's written numerous books, but in particular, his landmark book was the negotiations that brought about the Geneva Accords in 1988 between Pakistan, Afghanistan, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And I was there for the whole period of the Geneva Accords and saw him working in action. I was reporting for several newspapers at the time. And I think, you know, although he was a very junior diplomat at that time, his voice was possibly the most important in the Pakistani delegation. So I'm going to ask Riaz to look at the Geneva Accords, what was gained, what was lost, what was learned. And then we have Vali Nasr, who needs no introduction, a scholar of the highest caliber, who's written numerous books on Iran and has been an activist in being part of the team put together by Richard Holbrooke, the US negotiator, to try and bring peace. And unfortunately, that fell apart after Ambassador Holbrooke died and there was a regime change in Washington. So, Riaz, let me start with you. I give you 10 minutes. Tell us about Geneva and what lessons can we learn from Geneva for today? What mistakes did we make in Geneva that should not be repeated today? Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed Rashid, for your very generous words for me. Geneva, I'll try to touch upon some of the important turns and developments. Okay, I think. I'll try to touch upon some of the important developments and turns soon after the Soviet intervention, which in my view were where key decisions were involved and how they helped with the negotiations. But then I'll also move on to the post-Geneva period, the Taliban, and briefly touch upon the later developments in the 10 minutes that you have allocated to me. The first important decision was after the Soviet intervention that we had emergency meeting of the Security Council in January 1980, and we had soon after an emergency meeting of the UN General Assembly. So there we had to decide about the resolution, what kind of pitch we have to make. And there we were very circumspect. Finally, we decided that we are only going to ask for withdrawal of foreign troops. No naming of Soviet Union, no criticism of Soviet Union. It did two things. One was that, of course, any naming of Soviet Union or would have provoked hostility from the Soviet Union. Secondly, it would have reduced the support within the UNGA. So we were able to maintain a high support, and that was indicative of what we used to call at that time. When I say we, it's not just Pakistan, but also those who supported Pakistan's point of view, United States and others, the Western powers, many of the Islamic countries, so on and so forth. So we were able to maintain that support until 1987. 88, the situation changed because Geneva Accords were signed at that time. So that was the first thing. Second important decision was when Perez de Cuellar, who was the Secretary General, he wanted to initiate proximity talk involving Pakistan, Afghanistan, Soviet Union, and United States. So at that time, Pakistan thought that there should be two agenda items apart from others. One was withdrawal of time frame for withdrawal of Soviet troops. Second, in our view, what was important was that some kind of a government of national reconciliation or a broad-based government. So those two things. This continued almost about 9-10 months. United Nations could not deal with a situation where it would de-recognize a sitting member, and member meant Afghanistan, which was represented by the Babra Karmal government at that time. So finally, we had to decide that no, we will drop the second proposal, which is relating to the government of national reconciliation and broad-based government. And we focused on the question of time frame for Soviet withdrawals. Other important agenda items were, of course, non-interference, non-intervention, which could be handled very easily, and the guarantors for the Geneva Accords. The third important stage came when Gorbachev came, and he decided to leave Afghanistan, to withdraw from Afghanistan. First, he informed Najibullah, and that was September 1986. And then he, in fact, Vorontsov, his vice foreign minister, he invited Mr. Sattar, who was our foreign secretary, and in December 1986, and he very clearly, Vorontsov conveyed to us that we want to withdraw from Afghanistan. And he said, ironically, that we want Pakistan's help. We want you to cooperate with us for a government of national reconciliation, something that we were asking earlier. Unfortunately, that was a period when there was Junejo, Ziaul Haq tensions, so we could not focus on this whole issue. ISI at that time thought that maybe this was tactical on the part of the Soviets, and they wanted to weaken the resistance. So, and I can give you one example that the Afghan Cell meeting, which was the most important body to discuss Afghanistan, it met in April, the first meeting after this visit in December of Mr. Sattar to Moscow. It met after 4 months in April. And in that, Mr. Junejo, he insisted that he would preside over the Afghan Cell meeting. He kept Mr. Ziaul Haq out when everybody knew that it was Mr. Ziaul Haq who was running the Afghan policy at that time. The Soviets waited for about a year, and in November 1987, they announced a 1-year time frame. Now, 1-year time frame was a workable time frame. Mr. Ziaul Haq, General Ziaul Haq, he woke up to this. He said, what is happening? This is a good time frame. So he made a public statement at that time. Time frame is not a problem. The problem is broad-based government, government of national reconciliation. We must work for that. And he gave a formula himself. He said, I give a formula 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, the Kabul representation, 1/3 Mujahideen, 1/3 Muhajirin. Anyway, next day, Yunus Khalis, who was the representative of, spokesperson of the Tanzimat, he said that is Ziaul Haq's formula, that is not our formula. So basically, the struggle to grab Kabul started. Gorbachev sent Vorontsov, who was the vice foreign minister, in February 1988, prior to the last Geneva Accords, the Geneva negotiations. He said, at that time, we brought message reducing the time frame by further 2 months. And he said, please sign Geneva Accords because we want to go under the aegis of the Geneva Accords, under the UN auspices, so to say. Ziaul said, look, time frame is not the problem. You must stay in Afghanistan. And he said, and I'm quoting, I was there in the meeting, in that meeting, 8th February 1988, that I'll say from rooftops that the Soviets are there at my invitation. Let's work for a government of national reconciliation or a broad-based government. So Vorontsov said that my mandate was to request you and get an agreement to sign the Geneva Accords. Finally, he said, since you are insisting, therefore I'm prepared to go back if you agree on 2 things. One, that we have a timeline, 4 months, 3 months, 4 months, that if we fail to have a government of national reconciliation, you will sign Geneva, we will go. Second, that you will persuade the Tanzimat leaders to talk to Najibullah in some format. Ziaul said that, look, we should not be thinking in terms of time frame, we should work for this government, and it is very difficult to persuade these people that we should work together, etc., etc. On that, Vorontsov said, Mr. President, whatever you had been saying was all tactical. We will leave with or without Geneva. But if we leave without Geneva, there would be incalculable consequences for our relations with Pakistan. The meeting ended at that. Later on, Ziaul asked all of us to stay back and said that, what did he mean by incalculable consequences? Anyway, then Ziaul focused. He knew that the broad-based government was not possible. He focused on what was called positive symmetry, that the Americans continue to supply arms to this side and the Soviets continue to supply arms to the other. This was settled finally in the first week of April 1988, and we signed Geneva. There was only one issue which was settled the last, and that was a formulation on the border. We had a reference to border because after all, if we are talking about non-interference, non-intervention, then there has to be some border. The Kabul regime, Najibullah was there. So Najibullah refused. He said, no, I cannot accept that. No reference to border was acceptable to Kabul. Shevardnadze has to travel from Moscow to Kabul. He sat there. He couldn't convince them. Then he had to request Islamabad that please, you accept some vague term which was bordering regions, etc. We accepted that and Geneva was signed. One of the other aspects of it was that there was a statement by Perez de Coyard that efforts will continue for a broad-based government. So after Geneva, the Cordovez came to Pakistan. He stayed. How much? I have overshot? Well over. Oh my God. Okay. So I'll stop here because I think I can talk about these things for hours. What I'll say is that I'll just mention important. Jalalabad was extremely important. If we had succeeded in Jalalabad and placed a government of interim government over there, things would have been very different. But Jalalabad was messed up for 2 reasons. One, the important commanders were not interested in that. Secondly, Pakistan failed to provide generalship and asked these Mujahideen commanders and leaders to basically to attract defections. What happened was there were some Takfiri elements with Yunus Khalis, and the first batch of defectors from Jalalabad, about 90 soldiers, they were massacred. Then the second batch of 60 was massacred. After that, the the Afghan army dug its heels. And I know for a fact, because I have been told later on by many, that Najibullah had written off Jalalabad, and he wanted to defend Kabul from at Sarobi. But after these massacres, they were. In fact, we tried to rectify that later on in Khost, and we succeeded. But Khost was in 1992, which was a different story because by then the Soviet Union had collapsed. Najibullah was on his last legs. We then come to the period Taliban, etc. Then we come to the American intervention, and I'll finish with this just comment. There were three major errors which the Americans made, two of which Pakistan alerted to them. We were basically saying that please bring into the fold of Bonn process the reconcilable Taliban. Taliban are different than Al-Qaeda, but the Americans lumped Al-Qaeda and Taliban together as terrorists. First mistake. Second mistake was that we alerted them that don't allow the Northern Alliance to take control of Kabul. You take control of Kabul. The Americans should take control of Kabul. Perhaps that could not have been done because that would have required a great number of American troops on the ground. But nonetheless, later on this was realized that this created a lot of difficulty and the ethnic problems. The last one was that even in 2002, the Americans were not serious about Afghanistan. They were very complacent. In 2002, there were about 10,000 American troops in Afghanistan. You can't stabilize a country of that size with 10,000 troops, whereas they diverted to Iraq, where they put 150,000 troops. Okay, that was the last mistake.
Thank you. Vali, I'm going to allow you to, first of all, answer some of the points, interesting points he's raised. For example, he said that the Soviets were interested in only in the withdrawal of troops, and this was the main item on the agenda. And today, when the Americans are negotiating with the Taliban, that's the main item on the agenda. But I'd like you also to give us a summary of this period of the 90s, pre 9/11. And then post 9/11, what happened, and the Holbrooke Initiative in particular. What was Richard Holbrooke trying to aim at that perhaps Zalmay Khalilzad is doing or is not doing?
Well, thank you, Ahmed. You obviously know more about this topic than anybody else. Let me focus mostly, I think, on the Holbrooke period, on the Obama period, and today, and why this might work and why it didn't work under Holbrooke. And I do agree with Riaz Saab that Americans were not serious or didn't quite understand the importance of securing Afghanistan after removing the Taliban. It was a sort of an idea that has been repeated itself, namely you remove the antagonistic government in power and then things will work out on themselves. So the Americans are very good at the military part up front, but not very good at securing the peace later on, and so they had to deal with that consequence. Obama was perhaps ahead of where the American public was when he came in. It was the beginning of war fatigue in America, that large numbers of Americans wanted out of Iraq, out of Afghanistan. He understood that, and he clearly is on the same page as President Trump on wanting out of Afghanistan. Obama thought Afghanistan is not strategically important to Pakistan, to the United States. The only issue in Afghanistan is really a terrorist attack in the United States. But he also was not willing to think about talking to the Taliban. It was too politically sensitive domestically. He was afraid he would be accused of talking to terrorists, and then that would make it difficult. So in a way, Holbrooke was waging guerrilla warfare within the administration. He was trying to push the agenda that, look, we cannot win the war in Afghanistan militarily. We cannot just withdraw. It would also be very dangerous to Pakistan. The best way out of Afghanistan is talking. End of the day, this has to be a negotiation. I remember one time I was with him in Paris, and we were passing Hotel Bristol, and he pointed to that, and he said, look, I spent 6 wonderful months in that hotel as a young man negotiating on the team that was negotiating with the North Vietnamese to finish the war in Vietnam. The negotiations collapsed. The war went on for a number of years, and tens of thousands of people, more people died. And in the end, Vietnam ended around the table. It didn't end around the battlefield. And for him, Vietnam was sort of the very reference point to him. The Taliban were like the Viet Cong, and maybe in some ways, Pakistan, in his imagination, was like the bigger powers that were supporting the Viet Cong, and you had to deal with them. I mean, his idea always was that you're not going to finish this war without understanding what is Pakistan's regional interest. You can't get their cooperation without understanding their interest. That's why he spent so much time in this country. Literally every 6 weeks, he was here talking to all the people that mattered in order to get that understanding. But he was unsuccessful in Washington. I mean, there's a lot of talk about personal drama that Obama would not give him time. But essentially, everybody understood that they need to protect the president from Holbrooke. They didn't want it to leak that the idea of talking to the Taliban is being discussed in the White House. So, in a way, he never got it going. And I think Pakistanis, the Taliban, everybody else understood that America is not serious about negotiations with the Taliban. This is a Holbrooke project, but Holbrooke doesn't even have the president's backing. So why would the Taliban get into serious talks? And why would Pakistan support the process if you're not actually serious about it? And even to the extent that the administration in America talked about this, it was about getting Kabul to talk to the Taliban, but without the Pakistanis in the room. And that created suspicion between the US and Pakistan over what the talks mean. And the Pakistan then was uncooperative in supporting this. For instance, most famously, although there are times they helped, there are times they didn't help, but the case that sort of captured American imagination was when the CIA began to make contacts with Mullah Baradar, that immediately was arrested. And sort of that channel was closed off. And in the end, so there was no real, there was in the end talking to the Taliban, but there was no sort of serious effort. Now, President Trump is basically picking up where Obama left off. There is no daylight between the way the two of them see Afghanistan. I mean, they may be different on many different ways, but they both want out of Afghanistan, except I think Trump is actually serious. And there are a number of reasons for it, which is important to when you say, why it didn't work then and it's working now. So one is that, the groundswell of war fatigue in America has grown. On the left side of the ledger, people who vote for Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, and on the right, Trump supporters, none of them won wars. You gradually have a generation that has come of age after 9/11 or during 9/11 that basically thinks wars of expensive catastrophes. They don't glorify war. They want the American government to pay for the student debt, not for wars. And they basically ultimately are people who are voting, their views matter. So, yes, in Washington or in the establishment, you may have people who still think along old ways of using military power, or the Pentagon may think we should stay in Afghanistan. But Pentagon's view literally has very little popular support in America. And this is now the longest running war in America. There's even some degree of political benefit that comes from the president who ends this war. And I think given how President Trump is enamored with the idea of being the first to do something and get that distinction, he wants to be the president who ends this war. So there is popular support for ending this war. Secondly, President Trump, unlike President Obama, is not afraid of the military and is not afraid of being accused of being weak on national security. Whereas Obama was, like many other Democratic presidents, was afraid of the Pentagon, was in some ways goaded by the Pentagon into positions. Trump basically can lord over the generals any which way he wants. I mean, you can see it. He can interfere in the process, he can fire them, he can mock them in speeches. He's not one to be bullied or goaded by the military into having to follow a strategy. So I always sort of say it half jokingly, but it's literally the case. So when he came in, he wanted to know why this war has taken so long and why isn't it ending? And what does it take to end it? And I guess the military, as is usual, they said, well, we need more troops and more time. And he said, wrong answer. You get half the time and half the troops, and if it's not finished, I'm just going to pull out, or I'm going to privatize the war. I'm going to give it to Blackwater to run the security. And so that mindset is very much there. So for better or worse, on Afghanistan, he's serious. The signal to Taliban, to Pakistan, to China, to Russia, to Iran, to everybody was that he wants out, and he wants this war to end, and to end quickly. The second important issue is that the domestic American political preoccupation or obsession with terrorism has ended, thanks to President Trump. So, I mean, half of America thinks that the existential threat to America is Trump himself. The other half thinks that existential threat to America is not Arabs, Muslims, terrorism, it's Mexicans, Guatemalans, and migrants. So, and President Trump has literally changed the focus in America from the Middle East to Mexico, Guatemala, and the like. So the most important, thing the Americans can do, in their opinion, for their national security is to build a wall. So he has downgraded terrorism as a national security obsession, and that has great ramification domestically. So there's much more room to say we can come out of Syria, or we can come out of Afghanistan, and nothing will happen. And unless there is a big explosion in New York that might refocus Americans on terrorism, it's much easier to say, well, look, if the Taliban come back to Kabul, so long as there is no terrorism coming out of Afghanistan, the rest of it really is not our concern. And I think that's the mantra that is followed. So he has appointed Khalilzad to basically do what Holbrooke wanted to do, except he has actually given Khalilzad support. And it's very clear that the administration is supportive of an end to war. Now, the devil is in the details about what kind of a deal they end up with. And particularly what's opaque to me is it's easy to see what a sort of basic, as you said, a withdrawal agreement is, a troop withdrawal, but it's not very clear that what would Afghanistan look like after the Americans leave.
Thank you. Let me just say, I mean, one of the really strange things is that Gorbachev starts off by telling everyone, we are pulling out come what may. We don't care a damn what happens in Kabul. And yet, towards the end of the Gorbachev era, as Riaz has stated to you, the Russians are the most pushy for a government in Kabul. They desperately want a government in Kabul, particularly to save Najibullah and to give the communists some kind of role. And here we have President Trump, who starts off by saying, I don't care a damn about the government in Kabul, what these Afghans get up to, let them kill each other. All I'm interested in is getting American troops out of Afghanistan. And now he's actually allowed American diplomats to negotiate, possibly to help negotiate for a government in Kabul. So both these both these superpowers have moved from one position to a completely opposite position. And so what do you think it is? I mean, what are the real fears about not having a government in Kabul? And why will that affect the big powers?
What's the effect of not having a government?
You see, Kabul plays very heavily in the psyche of the Afghans. It's always the place from where the Afghans rulers have ruled the rest of the country. If you would recall, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Najibullah's exit, what was happening? Gulbuddin and Ahmad Shah Massoud, they were fighting for Kabul. They were not fighting in the rest of Afghanistan. So Kabul is very, very important symbolically. And it is important to have some kind of a government, even if it is a weak government, to have some kind of a government sitting in Kabul which represents the unity of the country. But as I see it, I don't see a very neat solution or move towards peace. In Afghanistan is very fragmented, but one hopes that after the agreement between the Taliban and the Americans, the violence reduces, and there is some agreement on at least the start of an intra-Afghan dialogue. That would be very important, but that would be a very big hurdle to cross. And unless the Afghans themselves are able to put together something, and there I would say one thing, that my experience is that if you leave the Afghans alone, they are in a better position to come to an agreement, rather than if the outsiders are messing around and prodding them.
Yeah.
Well, you know, when the Americans started this process, they actually didn't think about a government in Kabul. Ambassador Khalilzad started directly with the Taliban and with the help of Pakistan to get the Taliban to the table, and it almost looked to everybody that already the United States has given Afghanistan to the Taliban. To his credit, actually President Ghani surprised everybody by basically being able to create certain blocks to this process and make the intra-Afghan dialogue relevant. I think the Americans, I don't think they particularly care about women's rights or what the Taliban might do in Afghanistan, so long as they don't create an embarrassment. But I think there's a realization that if there is no agreement about a government before they leave, if they end up having to fight, as Riaz Saab said, for Kabul, then it opens the door to uncertainties. And I think the Americans would want to leave Afghanistan with a sense that at least for a decent interval, for a number of years, that things don't fall apart immediately. And particularly for Trump, if it falls apart 6 years from now, it's past this time. He just doesn't want to deal with Afghanistan in the next 5 years, let's say, in his mind after he gets elected. And for that, he needs at least some kind of a political agreement.
Well, all the accords we had before, actually the Geneva Accords and the Bonn Agreement, which actually signaled the new era, they did not really address the problem of forming a government in Kabul. Now, I mean, do you think the Khalilzad and President Trump really are committed to trying to help form a government in Kabul? I mean, certainly that mandate of Khalilzad, you're absolutely right, has gone from troop withdrawal, US troop withdrawal, to now trying to help President Ghani to set up a government. But we have a real crisis. We've just had election results in Afghanistan which have endorsed President Ghani as president again. These elections are not acceptable to the Taliban, nor are they acceptable to the Afghan opposition. What happens in any kind of peace deal? How do you negotiate when half the country and half the population is not accepting the results of the election?
So I think it actually might make it easier at some level if you begin to say, well, okay, there is no one government there's no one voice in Kabul to talk to. So Abdullah is one faction and Ghani is another faction, and sort of in a bond process kind of an environment, they all have to come to the table. So it makes it a different negotiation than you have government and Taliban, rather than to say it's Taliban and all the other factions. But I actually see the real sort of Achilles heel we don't talk about here, particularly on the political settlement, is Iran. you cannot get to a political deal. A military deal is between America and the Taliban, the two combatants on the ground. But once you get to the political deal, the other big elephant in the room are the Iranians. And Khalilzad understands that, and I think is eager to sort of find a way to bring him in. But the Iranians also understand that if America really wants out of Afghanistan and they need us, then let's talk about the other things that we need from you. So Iran has gone from trying to be helpful to basically saying, okay, now maybe we need to export more oil before we come to the table. So it sort of has shown some of the problems with America's policy towards Iran, that is sort of the compartmentalization doesn't work. So the Iranians are holding out, and I don't think without Iran you could actually have a successful negotiation on the political front.
As I had said, that I don't see a very neat end, and there could be a protected process when it comes to intra-Afghan dialogue. But in any negotiations or dialogue, there are two things. One is format, the other is substance. Substance, of course, will have to be determined by the Afghan parties. Fortunately, in this case, insofar as format is concerned, there are multiple formats which are available. I think Russia can play a very important role, Moscow, because Moscow is an avenue where all these parties, they can gather. I am not that much concerned about the factions within the Kabul government. In fact, that's a positive thing, because that basically means that the Kabul government would not want to sort of exercise any overwhelming pressure or want to have an overwhelming position in any negotiations. But the contents are such that they are quite intractable. There's the question of the constitution, there's the question of power sharing, and it is not going to be not easy. One thing that one hopes can materialize at the end of the process is that where there are these regional influences, there the Taliban influence will also consolidate and recognized. Like you have the other warlords in the north, in the west, in the east. So similarly in south and southwest, the Taliban influence would be recognized over a period of time while the intra-Afghan dialogue is taking place, and that these Afghan parties are able to have some kind of a dispensation, political dispensation, which involves the constitution, etc. And I agree with Vali Nasr that Iran has a very important role to play. But Iran's importance is because it has solid backing for certain groups in Afghanistan, like the Northern Alliance, like the Hazaras, and there it can play an important role and hopefully a positive role. Similar to the role that Pakistan play, but about Pakistan's role, I would say, we have an inbuilt role by virtue of geography, culture, and all that, and demographic overlap. But we should not be eager to play this role. This role will come to us like the Americans had to come to us to help with the negotiations with the Taliban. So similarly, that role will come to us, but if we try to be eager, then we only create concerns.
I think Riaz Saab is absolutely right, but he brought two points to mind listening to him. So one is going back to when Holbrooke was working on this issue. At some point, he came to the conclusion that it's very difficult to get negotiations going directly with the Taliban. And maybe the best place to start, at least as a prelude, is that you have to go, rather than from inside out, go from outside in. In other words, engage all the main regional stakeholders in Afghanistan. get them talking to each other, see what is the area of interest that they all sort of overlap. And that would bring us a sort of a support for the negotiation process. I mean, just before he died, he even got both India and Pakistan to agree to talk narrowly on the issue of Afghanistan, at least start the dialogue. And then he died, and that nothing came of it. And I think that's important. In other words, to create a common view between, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, the United States, China. I mean, India is now sort of out of the game, but all of the people who are stakeholders in Afghanistan to come to some agreement about at least the bare minimum. And I think in terms of, you raised the important issue of lessons learned. I think for Pakistan it's very critical that it handles this in a way, the way forward, that it doesn't end up provoking the recreation of the alliance that backed the Northern Alliance. In other words, if you alienate Iran, India, and Russia in this process, that then basically you're back to 1980s. They're going to try to get back in the game by supporting any opposition to whatever America and Pakistan put together in Kabul. And I think, right now, Americans can't talk to the Iranians, but Pakistanis can. And Pakistanis should be talking to Iranians and trying to sort of at least get them some clear kind of communication about what Pakistan's intentions are and how Iranians have to understand it. Pakistanis should be talking to the Russians directly about this. And not rely on the Americans necessarily doing this. America plays a very important role, but that doesn't mean that the regional actors don't matter. I mean, let's not forget, America's leaving, right? But Pakistan, Iran, Russia, they're going to be here forever. They're going to be Afghanistan's neighbors forever. They have a bigger stake in this than America has, and they shouldn't just defer to America on this.
One second. I want to ask you two very quick questions, quick answers, because we don't have much time, and I'd like some questions. What happened to China? China was taking enormous interest in Afghanistan up to about a year ago and was helping mediate a settlement. It's now disappeared from the scene. And secondly, do you support the idea of a UN mediator appointed by the Security Council to actually now mediate in Kabul for an Afghan government, rather than having an Afghan diplomat do it, an American diplomat do it? Riaz, very briefly, Riaz.
Yeah, China's role. China can have a very important role after there is a modicum of peace in Afghanistan. Because China can play a role in the economic development, economic reconstruction of Afghanistan. They have already have their interests indicated in the INEC, etc. But China has not been traditionally playing a very active role in terms of mediation efforts. It has been providing a format, and one format which involves the Kabul government, Pakistan, and China itself is an important one. Multiplicity of these formats is important for the intra-Afghan dialogue. So that is what I will say about China, that its role will really emerge after the peace starts settling down. Secondly, about the UN. UN is weak, let's be honest. But UN is acceptable to everybody. Therefore, it can have a benign role. But let us not ignore the elephant in the room. And the elephants, there is not one elephant, but there are elephants in the room, and those elephants are United States. Their troops are there. And it's good that they will keep some of their troops at present, because if they withdraw lock, stock, and barrel, then there would be chaos and there would be conflicts. So there is only partial withdrawal which has been committed. Then, of course, there is Pakistan. There is Iran. And, of course, Russia to a certain extent. So all of them play a role, but they should allow space for the Afghans to work out a political dispensation.
Vali.
No, absolutely true, and I do think Riaz Saab is right. I mean, you need the cover of the United Nations. Ultimately, it's not that the process has already started, so it's not easy to go back and now say UN leads it. But on the other hand, the first process between the United States and the Taliban can be about military de-escalation and troop withdrawal. But the process around a political agreement, I think the United States actually does need the UN. Because right now, Iran and the United States cannot talk unless it's under a UN umbrella. Or if you think about a Bonn agreement again, then that has to be convened by the United Nations. So again, I think the Ambassador Khalilzad understands this. The question is whether he can sell it to an administration that's generally hostile to multilateral institutions.
And China?
I think Riaz Saab is absolutely right. The Chinese don't necessarily get involved in the mediation, and this is not something that they have done or they're ready to do right now.
Just one minor comment. During the Geneva, you remember that one of the agenda was guarantors. Yeah. So if there is ever a need for some kind of guarantees in the context of the intra-Afghan dialogue, then I think UN will become handy, and there the Russians, the Americans, and others can play a role.
Right. Okay, let me throw it open. We have Sherry Rahman here. On kar de.
Thanks. I'm Sherry Rahman, and I have a quick question for our two panelists who've done a really excellent job of unpacking what's going on and what overshadowed the process. Very quickly, Riaz Saab, you mentioned the crucial bit about guaranteeing guarantors. I want to take this a little further. With the rush to the exits, it's very well for us to say, okay, the Taliban will do this together with the, intra-Afghan dialogue. It's not pieced together to this day, any intra-Afghan dialogue. In fact, I see Afghan disunity at its highest peak, especially after a contested election. Pakistan has so far not even congratulated President Ghani, really. And we are looking at a fragmentation, if at all. You have the United States exiting very fast, and Vali says there's no interest in staying. I completely agree with that. Why would the Taliban, in this reduction of violence mode, not keep at their fighting posts, which they are, as I understand? You're better placed to tell me. Reduction in violence simply means that they retain their fighting posts. And then they go forward into what we are told is a ceasefire and then some agreement. Very good. Who guarantees any kind of agreement within that country which secures the rights of the women of Afghanistan? I'm glad Vali Nasr brought it up. But otherwise, in all the national security conversations, yes, women are brought in, and some token women have been brought in the big jirgas that are held. It's not a discussion. And women's rights are the first to go in any transition where contests are being fought locally, and there's no big central authority to impose order or even suggest a return to the agreement us on the table for talks with them. And I used to say, well, exactly what you said. Pakistan will remain here. You have not been able to touch the Haqqanis in any significant way all the way through Afghanistan. You tell us to bomb smithereens out of them, you'll be gone. And guess what they'll be doing to us? So don't you think Pakistan is owed an apology on that?
Right, thank you.
You are, but you're not going to get it. No, I think actually that we're in a very interesting time period. It's just like you would have never imagined that Sirajuddin Haqqani would be writing in New York Times and would be writing with such sort of sending essentially a love note to President Trump, because that's what this was. In other words, it was to make it really easy to sell this deal. If the most contentious element of the Taliban writes this op-ed saying, we're going to work with you, we're going to address all of your concerns, then that's a key issue. there is no doubt that human rights, women's rights are the sacrificial lambs here. In other words, this is not on the, I mean, it's on the agenda, but it's not going to be what is going to make this go forward. And of course, the fear is that there's going to be a decent interval. So the Taliban are going to hold their fire and live by whatever agreement is until the last American soldier is left. And then after that, they can resume fighting under any pretext. We've seen that in many places. And America's not going to come back. In other words, once America leaves, the bar for America coming back is extremely high. And he always reminds me of the Balkan Agreement, which ended the war in Yugoslavia, that if the NATO troops had not remained, the fighting would have resumed. And NATO troops remained in Bosnia they were always there for 1 year, but they have been there always for 1 year. In other words, it keeps getting renewed, and that has allowed sort of this to gel. But they would have gone back to fighting, and I think that's the worry. So for Trump, this is about leaving. This is not about a stable future for Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Well, first I would say, Senator Sherry Rahman, what you have said only further throws light on the complexity of the problems, complexity of the challenges, which must not be underestimated. Anyway, one thing I would say, we cannot take the exit of United States in toto for granted. Because until last year, as far as I know a little bit, the so-called establishment, which basically means DOD, the defense, etc., they wanted to have some kind of a footprint, continue in Afghanistan. Now they are talking about 8,000, that they will leave 8,000. 8,000 in Bagram and Shindand, I think they can continue there. And they would only intervene by air whenever they need to. Reduction of violence. The Afghans, I think, are also pragmatic. The Taliban, if I were to be a Taliban and I were to give them advice, I would say, okay, you can target here and there the Afghan forces, but don't target the Americans. So the thing is that what I see is that they may not target the Americans, they may target here and there for the consolidation of their influence. And I think they would be able to consolidate their influence because why the ANA, the Afghan army, failed in areas like Helmand and Kandahar and Uruzgan, etc., all that. It was because they were fighting outside their territories. These were Northern Alliance people. Most of them, Tajik will not fight in Kandahar. He will not fight in Paktika. So there is a problem there. It is not like Pakistani army, which you can deploy anywhere, in Punjab, in Sindh, Baluchistan, anywhere. You see, we have a very different tradition of a conventional army. Secondly, I would say that some of the things which have been achieved during this period, and they are very positive, from Pakistan's point of view also, they are not going to be totally reversed. One of them is what you mentioned, the human rights, the question of women doing jobs, education, etc., all that. And I must say here that Bill Richardson had gone to Kabul in year 2000 while the Taliban were there. And he met, at that time, the president of the Taliban, Mullah Rabbani, who died of cancer later on. And Mullah Rabbani did promise to Bill Richardson that if you reach out to us, give us some help, etc., we will open schools for girls and we will allow some kind of jobs, etc., because we do need them. So there may be now, and I am very happy that all this activity, international activity, has been taking place now away from Quetta and Peshawar, because at that time, these poor fellows, their sort of touch with modernity was Peshawar and Quetta. Now they at least see what is happening in Doha, what is happening in the UAE, what is happening elsewhere. Right. So in Moscow. So the thing is that I think that they would basically be far more circumspect and be prepared to accommodate things here and there.
Right. I'll ask Zahid. Zahid Hussain. Last question.
Yeah.
Be brief.
I think the most difficult period will start after the signing of this agreement between Taliban and the American government. We have still not clarity. There's no clarity actually what will be the format of intra-Afghan dialogue, number one. Because the Taliban have already rejected the election result, and they say that they won't recognize Ghani's government. The second thing, which is left there, the role of Afghan army. Now, there's a formative force there. So, in case actually this intra-Afghan dialogue gets into disadvantage and gets protected, what will be the role of Afghan army? Do you think actually there's a fear of them being, becoming fragmented, as we have seen in the past?
Yes, I think there is always a danger of the Afghan army fracturing. First of all, it doesn't have that much longevity. It's only a very recent phenomenon. Secondly, I think Riaz put his finger on what has been the problem with the Afghan army, which is in a country that's divided between Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Pashtuns and Hazaras, it's very difficult to deploy troops which are of a different ethnic origin in a different location. And so it's questionable, for instance, if the Afghan army can be successful in the south. And then it's difficult to see it would be successful once the Americans are gone and they have no motivation or no interest in the outcome of a fight between Tajiks and Pashtuns and Hazaras. And Afghanistan itself really does not have the means to buy weapons and ammunition and things that it needs in order to continue fighting. So more than it is possible to think that it will fracture. It would become either militias on its own, or it would join, Northern Alliance or join the Taliban, and might not be able to sustain itself.
Well, I agree with Wali Nasr. The only thing I'll say is that the role of the Afghan army, as I see, would be part of the agenda of the intra-Afghan dialogue. Now, you also asked about what would be the format of the intra-Afghan dialogue. I think it would be a multi-layered process. You see, if they meet in Moscow, all of them as parties, it would be part of the intra-Afghan dialogue. If they meet in Kabul, and I hope they are able to meet in Kabul, or they meet in Peshawar, that would be part of the intra-Afghan dialogue. So there are these, Beijing is another avenue. Doha is a cutout avenue. If Doha somehow the other is not acceptable to Mr. Ashraf Ghani, then there can be any other Central Asians. So it will be a multi-layered process as I see it. It would be, I suspect, a protracted process. Secondly, as I had already mentioned, that the American presence, residual presence, is going to continue over there. So this is what I can say in response to.
Excuse
but
me,
we should be careful about one thing. The mistakes that we have made. We must not allow our policy to fall into this ethnic divide, which was a grave mistake that we committed in 1990s.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have to finish, I'm afraid.
My question is why don't Pakistan and American and the government of Afghanistan and the fundamentalists, why don't they file a case in International Court of Justice? Over there, they will say we have done this. Pakistan has done a lot of for the justice. Number one, and second is that.
Madam, can you sit down? Can we leave that to a later date? Because I have to empty.
The role of India, please. Will they act as a bull in a china shop, or they will support this process? Please.
I don't know where that's coming from. Anyway, let me just say two things. First of all, this question of the army is very interesting because actually in all the other earlier agreements, Geneva, Bonn, there was no real standing Afghan army. There were militias who formed part of the negotiations, but there was no standing Afghan army. And this is the first time we'll be negotiating a peace settlement in Afghanistan with a standing Afghan army, no matter how weak or strong it may be. Secondly, I just want to end by saying that I think it's absolutely vital that Pakistan end its interference in Afghanistan, that it recognizes the sovereignty of Afghanistan, the right for the Afghans to make their own decisions and not to be browbeaten into or being forced by outside powers, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and others, to be to follow their line. And I think, at the moment our relations are very tense with the Afghans. I think it is our responsibility to improve those relations, and I hope you do. I hope you've enjoyed this session. I think it's been very, very productive.